Hello, hello, hello. Can you hear me? Okay. Uh huh. Can you hear me? Is the mic working? Yeah. Well, it does. It's showing up here. But not here. That's a pretty sick shotgun mic. We need to get wireless. Well, I mean, ultimately it's plug in. Last night.
Because of the widget and the live stream thing, it starts off me. I couldn't see because there was no controls. I had to put my mouse over it. Too slow.
It's working.
Yeah, just be it. I can get myself in front of myself.
And I am quite loud right here.
Yeah. Okay. Works weird.
Yes.
Let's just be hopeful.
Oh, that's perfect. Put this here. No.
It sounds like it's trying to turn on. There you go. No,
I just swipe for my bank statement.
this one should be. There it is. Okay.
Like last time I had a credit card up there. Nice. Wax.
Don't put a credit card number up there. Well, that should be like. Maybe I have like one of those anonymous.
Nice. Okay. We gotten over this microphone yet.
We need a lavalier. Like it's really bad.
So,
You made it like increase the volume or you good?
no, please don't increase the volume.
Yeah, let me.
So, thank you everyone for coming out. If you weren't already downtown, our sincerest apologies for what you went through to get here, and we do appreciate it. We'll definitely be a little more aware of what's happening down here and the effects it might have on how we get here in the future. So, few things. If you haven't eaten, please do. There's salad and chicken and whatnot from Chick-fil-A. So, thank you to Tech Systems and Sebastian for providing that. Always much appreciated. Our other sponsors as well. Big Vision helps us out with various costs and things. They're an agency down the street. A couple people from Big Vision here tonight. Also, Power DMS for hosting us. Power DMS rocks. Thanks a lot. Yeah, so we have an ongoing evergreen call for speakers. Please, if you would like to speak about anything that might somewhat relate to React, let me or Lewis there in the middle, raise your hand, Lewis. Lewis and I organize this meetup. Please let us know. We would be more than happy to get you on the schedule and help you prepare your talk if you need that, what have you. Let's see. If you are not if you're not familiar with like ODevs and the Orlando Devs Slack, it's a Slack group. A lot of developers in Central Florida are on there. You can like ask questions. People post jobs and stuff there. So if you don't know about that, you can come see me or like Gabe or Dwayne or whoever about it afterward, and we'll be happy to get you an invite there so you can join. Speaking of Dwayne, many thanks to Dwayne. Dwayne is here on his own time, just streaming for us. He does that for a lot of the meetups in the area. It's super rad. We tried streaming like with another laptop, just like pointed right here, and it was very bad. Like I sent the link to somebody, and he was like, "I can't watch this, man. Just tell me, just send me the slides or something. 'Cause this is awful." So, thank you for that. Pretty awesome. So yeah, tonight Gabe is talking about. I don't want to spoil anything, but he's got a sweet library. Gabe is very passionate.
Use the descriptor.
Yeah,
You
sure.
can say that much.
Okay, well, the name of the library is React Use Controller, and it's sort of a reimagining of how to manage your state and application logic with hooks. Gabe is a super passionate, creative guy, and has written some other libraries that'll like blow your mind and make you rethink everything you know about React. Yeah, did I miss anything, Lewis? No. Cool. All right, take it away.
Let's go. So, as you know, my name is Gabe, and I'm going to be showing you something that I've been developing now. I've done a couple of lightning talks, some good, some not so good, but now I'm sort of prepared, so at least 50%. And so, what I'm going to show you is a tool that I made after really not liking how I was using hooks. Now, obviously, hooks are amazing. When they dropped, it changed everything. You know, you went from classes to having all sorts of, you know, these little just tiny functions that gave you so much functionality. And so you could simplify what you were doing so you didn't have to make a class and use set state and do all this crazy stuff. And so that was great. And I love hooks in theory, but I wasn't really loving them in practice. And so what React Use Controller is a way to make it a little easier. And, ooh, okay, that's not supposed to happen. That's my fault. Okay, so,
Could you try resharing your screen for me?
yeah, sure. Okay, so just
End it and try again?
just refresh.
Yeah,
Okay.
or either way.
Okay.
All right, now try
Start screen share.
and then the entire thing.
Is this one?
Okay.
Okay, awesome.
Now we're good.
Good.
We went blank for some reason.
Okay.
Awesome.
Yeah, now it unexploded. Excellent. So what it is a way to, it's kind of like a new layer of abstraction on top of hooks that lets you use them a lot more easier. And so it gives you as many of the benefits as it can while trying to hide away some of the classic challenges that I'm going to show you through some of these examples. So let's start with a really simple example here. We've got an element, it just counts. And so we use a hook, and hopefully everybody kind of gets the basic gist, is you destructure use state where the default is 0. And then you have number and set number. And so you display the number, and then you set the number when you want to change it. And so that sort of works okay. But here's the problem. When you start to use more than one hook, your app can start to look oogly, where you are destructuring a ton of different hooks and going number 1, set number 2, you know, everything under the sun. If you want it to be reactive and change and have responses, then it's going to be a lot of variables in your code that you have to keep track of. And you get even one of those things wrong, and your app starts acting weird. You got to debug it and everything. And then you start getting into some of the more advanced features of hooks, where you're like, you know, use context, use ref, use state, use effect, and God forbid you forget the array at the end of use effect, and your stuff refreshes every page when you didn't want it to. So that's not fun. Now, a couple months ago, I think in July or whatever, I had a talk that mostly circled around my #1 rule of hooks. Don't use a bunch of hooks in your components. They're hard to read, they're hard to refactor, they're hard to generalize, and honestly, it's hard to write. At least it was for me. When you have a ton of hooks all over the place, that was a fun experience. So I made a way for you to simplify that a lot. Get as many of the features of hooks as you can get for basically a very simple concept, which is a hook. So let's start with the first example that we had before, which is the set number. And we're going to improve this by using React Use Control. Now it's really simple. All you got to do, so we've got an example on the left, which is the old way you do it, and right way is the new way to do it. And so what you do is you first create a class, right? Just call it anything and put anything you want in there. You can have one variable, you can have many variables. It does not matter. And what you'll do is you'll use the superhook, use. And it's just use. It's not use state, not use ref, it's not use this, that, or another thing. It's just use. And so you're essentially using count control to control your component. And so what this does is it will essentially read your component. It doesn't exactly initialize it the way you might traditionally think. It's using it as an inference to know what you want this component to do. And when you use it, it's going to create, quote unquote, an instance. And that instance has tracked variables in it. Like it will go like for in and read all the variables inside that class. And now they're live. So if I were to go on click right here, and I were to say, hey, I want to, you know, take state number, and, you know, I'm going to read it, and that shows up as my number. But if I change the number, you know, plus equals and minus equals, well then, bam, it's going to refresh as it should. And so essentially what you've done is you're making it so that the component is responsive to the state belonging to this instance of a class, which means it will stay synced, which means you don't need to do a bunch of set state. You don't need to do a bunch of set this and set that, and all these hooks, you can use more than one, and it all works harmoniously. And so it looks a lot better when we go back to our previous example of the many, many hooks. Because right now, instead of creating many #1, #2, set #1, set #2, set #3, I just say count control, and I have the variables that I care about, which is number 1, number 2, and number 3. And then I say state, use control, as I did before, and I just consume them. So in this case, really this should, okay, yeah. So I'm pulling state number 1 in this variable, state number 2, and state, my typo on there one. But essentially, when I update these, I just select the one I want to update, and when any one of these changes, the component will re-render. Hence, you only really need to just use one hook, and anything that changes will make it refresh, because there's new information. And so, this is really good, especially with destructure. Now, I had this challenge when I was first writing this library, where I had state, and then I would destructure out like number 1 and number 2 and number 3, and I'd be like, oh man, how do I like exactly set variables now? I'd lose my destruction. And lo and behold, you really wouldn't think this, but apparently JavaScript doesn't think set is weird as a keyword in a destructure. It just like, okay. And so I was like, okay. And so what this does is I have 2 variables, set and get, and they're properties on this instance. And they're just going to look back to the instance. They literally just return this. And so as a result, I can do set dot number 1. You see what I did there? Instead of creating a bunch of set this, set that, I just say set dot whatever I want to set, and then it updates, and then I can just destructure it as I so desire, and then I get it just working. So far, does that make any sense? Does anybody have any questions with regards to that? No? Okay. So, that's all well and good. And so, we can destructure. Actually, no, it's different with this one, so let's move on. And so, here's the next thing that we can do. We can also put methods on this, and it will just happily change the variables in this. Now, I kind of forgot to put the on click. I really should have done that. But essentially, if I just edit this dot something, then it will also dispatch the event that something has changed as far as the component is concerned. So now I can start making interesting logic inside of my functions, or the methods that are in this class, and I can start doing asynchronous stuff, and I can start doing all sorts of events, and callbacks, and it's just really smoother than, say, using Redux or using MobX, if anybody's still using that. And so, let's go back to our very first example to just appreciate how clean this looks. You've got count control over here. It's got a number in it. It's got 2 methods, increment and decrement. And essentially, I kind of messed this up, so I got it. I forgot to do this. But essentially, what I would have done is destructure number, increment, and decrement, and then just put number, decrement, and increment just as the variables that exist for onClick, because they're bound. You know what I mean? So they don't need to actually be like, it's just cleaner, you know what I mean? And that way you can make all sorts of really dumb components that are just focused on style, presentation, and reusability. In fact, one of the greatest benefits of this is that you can just make one controller and it will be able to be reused in different components. So we have the top one, which was the first example, and we have another one that is a little more excited. And they both use the same logic, so you actually don't have to duplicate that logic. This would be kind of annoying if I wanted to make 2 versions of basically the same behaving component inside of my React app. If they, let's say I had different languages that I needed to support, and they needed to literally be different components, like say if I made it in Israeli, then I need to actually format it differently. It's not just a matter of replacing the text.
So quick question. So increment and decrement, I think I missed that. You don't have to call them in the context of the state.
So essentially, you see how they're equal to an arrow function?
Yeah.
So that's traditionally how you bind a method to the instance. Because what's really happening is that ES6 is actually moving these to the constructor and saying this dot increment equals this arrow function. Because it passes this through it, it's this for that given instance. So now when you call it directly, it is just reflecting that instance very simply. And that way, you just get this access for free, you know? And so I have made incredibly complicated components that have all different behaviors, all different sort of, you know, patterns. And I can just do async calls and all sorts of things. And anytime I just change a variable on it, it just works. Now, something to kind of explain what's going on is that the use hook right here is actually reading the prototype. So it's not exactly doing what you might think, where it's like, oh, instantiate it and turn it into an instance and then track it. It actually has to read the prototype and then start actually binding those methods. And then it takes all the variables that are in there at every level and turns them into what you would call the model. You know how React is a model view controller? Essentially, the variables are the model, the methods are the controller, and the component is the view, creating this nice little marriage of all these different behaviors that make everything good. Now, I would continue to some of the more advanced examples, but some of them didn't work. Oh, I forgot about this. So there was one more. So, kind of for free, because I still have all these class things and I'm doing all this analysis anyway, I thought, why not add a few convenience functions to help you get work done? So, remember that first example with the use effect? Hey, Victor.
Yeah, real quick question though, to expand upon what you were talking about. We can go back one slide.
Sure.
So the increment and the decrement are being called in the side controller or counter. Sorry, my vision's a little back from here. Wouldn't you still have to at least structure it off of the state? Or are you
I do. That was totally my bad. I just, when I was making this slide, I totally screwed up. I was trying to say that. This wasn't, I told you I was 50% prepared. I was kind of like last minute doing all this, like, this is why we actually ran late. It wasn't actually the traffic. I just used that as an excuse.
So that should just be state that.
That should be, so, I mean, I can update it, but I don't have dual screen, so I can't really do that on incognito. But basically, yes, that is supposed to just structure increment, number, and decrement, and then it's supposed to just work. Totally my bad on that one. So, over here, oh my god, I didn't even do it on this slide too, sorry. I just didn't come prepared. So, anyway, on the class, we have some functions that essentially, you know, like, in common parlance, you kind of configure what they do. You know, like did mount is kind of a duplicate for component did mount. Will unmount is a duplicate for component will unmount, but it's not really those. It's just essentially using use effect, you know? Because behind the scenes, it has to instantiate itself, do all the watchers, do everything. So essentially, it just calls these at those times, which means that I can just write a controller that kind of, you see how we're kind of going full circle? Because it's like we started with classes, and then we got to hooks, and then now we're back to classes. I think that it's a good place to be ultimately, because then you can say, okay, my component can be super stupid. All it has to know is what variables it's getting and what it's going to show them as. And then the controller can handle all the behavior. And then not only can you just have these controllers be straight objects, but you can actually extend them, so you could probably make hierarchical behavior. So you could, you know, make a component that had a number and increment and decrement, and then you have another one that extends it and it has a few extra behaviors for automatic stuff, and it'll just work nice. So in this situation, if the destructure was written properly, it would essentially create a timer. And the only reason it needs to do that is because it needs to remember the interval, otherwise you're like not garbage collecting properly. And so it's going to create a set interval where the function is literally just going to hit this dot number. It's just to increase it. It's going to see it got increased. It's going to dispatch the render, and your thing is going to start updating. And so actually, some of the examples kind of explode a little bit, so I got to show you this on Code Sandbox instead. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of pivot over to that. And so we're going to take a trip to GitHub here. Spell? Okay. And so we're going to go through some of the examples that I actually just kind of pulled from the README here. Kind of get on there. So here's an example that I just showed you. So over here, it's going to count automatically because wait, it's so contrast, but over here, we have the amount that is elapsed, and we have on mount, which is called on mount, go figure, sets an interval that just increases elapsed, and then when clear interval.
Can you blow it up a bit?
Oh yeah, sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, let me actually just split the still here because we really need that. So, and then, okay. So over here, you have the elapsed, the did mount, and you have the will unmount. And all the will unmount does is just do the garbage collection because we don't want to like have all these random intervals that never die. And then so as you can see, we just take elapsed, we destructure it out, present it, and then bam. Now this component can be styled any way we want, and it just works. And we can make more than one, and we can play around with how it behaves. And this is all just organized. Now, over here, to kind of correct previous egregiances, this would ultimately be what it was supposed to look like when I failed to destructure, is that you have number, decrement, and increment coming from the use call, and then now it just works, and all it really looks like in the XJS is just literally, hey, I want this with this style and this value, and here's my data, convert it into HTML for me, thank you. It's as simple as it could be. And so now we can start to get fancy, because now that we have gotten out of this pattern of having to do all these set states and hierarchies and stuff. It's like when we first got async and we stopped having, or actually when we first got promises and stopped having to use those like pyramids of death. It's like now you could be a little more creative with what you were doing, as opposed to when you were doing the callback hell. It kind of would stop after a point. You were like, okay, I'm not going to really experiment with this too much and make something really awesome. So at least you have to be really persistent. So I have an example here, which is a really good showing of how you can make a really fancy behaving app. So no actual styles, but here's what's going on. We have an agent. His name is Bomb. He needs to defuse the bomb, and he has 60 seconds to do that, or the cat may or may not die. But there is still time. Now, if Bond happens to be asleep at the wheel, we can call somebody else. And so I'm going to tap another agent, and it's going to pull random names. Well, where are those coming from? Well, what I've done is that over in this component, we have the function get somebody else. So you just click on it, get somebody else. This function is on the class controller. And it's an async function, just pretty straightforward. You're grabbing random user API, you're pulling the data from the JSON, you're getting the recruit from the results, and you're just setting this.surname to recruit.name.last from the API, of course. And so,
5 seconds.
I know, and then the cat may or may not die. Let's see what happens. So the cat died. Why did that happen? Well, that's actually pretty cool. So first, remaining is 0. So obviously, instead of showing the interface, we show the floated cat. But here's some stuff we did in order to make sure that didn't exactly go too poorly. So we have this function. It's called cut the drama. It's just a function, and it clears the interval, right? So we do our due diligence and garbage collection, and there's 2 instances where this is called. First, it's when time left equals 0, because we have this function called tick-tock, and tick-tock is called by the interval. And so when we mount, we say set interval as this.tick-tock, once every second, and then tick-tock will run. So it'll say time left, and it will minus this.remaining. So it's going to take that value, but it's also going to update, because of the minus. And so now, if time left equals 0, we cut the drama, clear the interval, and we're done. Also, if we unmount, we also cut the drama, because we also don't want to get rid of the component and fail to have garbage collected. And so, as you can see, this is just really easy to reason about what this thing does. You're not like reading through a bunch of set state calls. You're not reading through all of the hooks. I mean, imagine if you were trying to do this type of behavior in line with use effect and use ref and use state and use reducer, like all together, it would be a nightmare. And so by doing it with the class, you're just saying, hey, on the top, I have these variables. These are the ones I care about. If it changes, reflect that in the component. Here's my, life cycle methods. There's other ones that I provide, but these are the most simple ones. If I were to get any other ones, it would kind of get a little hairy as the specifics of the nuances. And then a few extra helper functions to describe how we're actually carrying those actions out. Victor, what's up?
Yeah, I have a question for you real quick. So, two-prong. Does the class still work with traditional life cycle methods? And if not, how would you implement should component update, right? So
Should
I'm not
component
asking
update.
like a dependency array.
So as of right now, I haven't implemented stuff like that, just because there were other patterns that would let me accomplish what is intended by those methods. There's a very kind of super beta, it's in production, like it works, it's live, but it's undocumented because I'm not 100% sure if it's stable yet. It's called watch, and what it does is it will actually take in your props. And so what you would do is you would actually I'm gonna show you in another example, but essentially there's another way to do this. And so you would take your props, and you might have like a const whatever, and you take whatever in there. And then I'm gonna show you this example later, so don't wonder why this is weird, but if I were to say sticky situation and then make it use, this won't work in this app just because it's not set up for that, but essentially I could actually replace it with watch, and what it would do is it would take props and it would incorporate the props into the watch values, and then you could actually prevent it from updating when those updates get dispatched. It's more advanced behavior, and it's going to take some documentation and a little bit of fixing to get it really out there, but right now it's not really in the documented ability of this library. But that's a really good question. As far as does it support regular methods, I guess in theory it could. If I were to wrap this instance in a class, as a higher order component, because essentially this can behave like a higher order component depending on how you use it. And so I could do that, but right now it just does not.
So if your class is the component or React,
You see,
you could inherit those methods.
the thing about this particularly is that in a lot of the cases where I'm using use controller, because this is not meant necessarily to literally replace your components, because if you were trying to use should component update in the first place, you'd be using a class straight up, and this wouldn't even work because this is that's not a functional component. So it's kind of moot in a sense, but it is something that I'm interested to see if we could make work. In any event, let's see. So I'm going to go back, and we're going to go to another example. So this is where it starts to get really cool, because essentially, by the way, Andrew, how far am I on time? I'm good? Okay. So we have the controller superclass. So this is the other way to do it. What I was showing you before was just the use and then take any class and turn it into a superclass. Great. But there are some really cool things we could do if we use the controller superclass instead. So essentially it works a lot the same way. We take controller from React, use controller instead, and that's the default export. You can call it whatever you want. It also works as like a named export as well, depending on what you feel like. And so what you take your controller and you extend controller with it. And so now instead of using use controller, it's actually a static method now. It's control.use. And so that behaves the same way. And so you wouldn't necessarily do it this way if you weren't going to take advantage of the super features that this has. But we'll keep going on and see what's cool about that. So first ability of extends controller is you can pass arguments to your constructor. That's cool. So I can actually tell props to go into control.use, and it's going to go into the constructor, and it's going to apply it. Now again, I did a typo, and this is not supposed to. It's not supposed to be how it looks. So just ignore that. you saw nothing. And also, when you start using TypeScript, extending controller becomes super duper 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 valuable, because now, when you use it in your component, it's actually type of fun activity. So we have fun activity right now, and we're going to watch paint dry. And so we have seconds so far, and we have the interval, and we're going to pass, it's already a number of minutes, and so we initialize it, get it all straightened out, set the interval like we did before, and cool. Now, we go to paint drying. So I've been staring for like this many seconds. I'm starting to like what I see with this paint drying. So what we did is we passed the number of minutes it already is. So now it's dynamic. Like now we can pass custom information into it, and it will just like start at whatever number of minutes it did by just taking the source, multiplying it by 60, and setting that as the initial number of seconds. So that's really, really cool. And so that's all well and good, but here's what's really special about this. If I were to open this up in Code Sandbox, it's kind of neat, because more often than not, I'm defining my control. I love it when stuff doesn't work. How? Sorry. Okay. Anyway, I don't quite know why that doesn't work. Let me see if I can fix it, because I really do want to show you something. Actually, it doesn't matter. Here's the cool thing I want to show you. So let's say I had my controller and it was in another module, just entirely. So I didn't actually have eyes on it. What if I wanted to pull in seconds so far? Oh my god, it actually shows me what is in this thing. So I get IntelliSense on the things I'm pulling out of this class, which is like super convenient, because now I can just like import a library that exports these type of controller classes. Like if you wanted to ship a bunch of custom controllers, you just document them. So I could say, I can go over here and let's just do something for an example. Like let's just use JDocs. I don't know if like Code Sandbox will work, but let's see. So I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna say number of seconds currently on timer. And so now, if I use it, please God, if I go seconds so far, it doesn't want to do it, but in VS Code it would. I'm not 100% sure why. Hold on a minute. I want to see if this is what. So it is on activity, but I don't. I guess just JS docs are not supported on it. But in any event, in VS Code it would do it. In fact, let me just try it. I don't know. It could work. Nah, just take my word for it. Anyway, we're going to leave and go to the next example. So here's like the holy bejesus best feature that I figured out that this thing could do. Like, it blew my friggin' mind. So let's say we have a class, and it's got the values in it, it's got some methods in it, whatever, we instantiate it. So I have this custom, there's a different method here. It's create. Instead of use, it's just create. And here's what it's going to do. It's going to return a provider instead. And so this provider will wrap inner foo and inner bar, right? And so these elements are sitting there inside this provider. I wonder what that does. So keep in mind that the instance of central is at this level. It's mounted to this app, instance. So now, let's say I have a bunch of other functions, and there are other components, and they're inside this provider. What I can do is I can say central, and I'm going to make this bigger so you can see, because I really want you to see how cool this is. So you can call central and use the word get. Now here's what this does. It grabs the nearest instance of central, that is its parent. Does that make sense? Like so far? No? Andrew's like, no, that doesn't make sense. So, if I were to really get you to understand it, you have to really understand context in general.
It travels up and down the tree.
Well, you see, the thing is that the way context works is that if you have a provider, it's going to provide some value to listeners that are inside of it using the same provider key, right? So in this case, the class itself is, it's like the class name and the class, like the class identifier itself is the literal key that it's using to decide, okay, I'm going to connect to this. And so here's what I'm going to show you.
So you don't have to import it?
Well, it's all in the same file, so I don't really have to import anything that's in the same file. So over here, it's the same file. And here's a really good example of what's going on here. So we have central, this is a control, and it could be at the top of our app, it could be at the top of some complex component, whatever. And it is sense controller. So it just has the data in it, nothing special about that, it's what I already showed you. And so I'm saying control.create. Now really, let's simplify it. I'm just going to use, and I'm going to just ask the provider. It does the literal same thing. So hopefully this makes it a little clearer what's going on. I'm pulling a provider. Now it's doing some fancy mumbo jumbo here. Like it's doing a lot of stuff behind the scenes to make this work. You would kind of like have add symbols for eyes if you took a look at it. And so now inside of inner foo and inner bar, they're inside this context, which means they can access this instance of provider. If they made more than one app, then you'd have several instances of this, and they'd go to their respective parent, okay? So now, inner foo, which is this one right here, this element, is pulling foo up, which is this method right here, and bar. And so it's presenting bar, and barb's click.
So that get is like use context?
It's like use context. Essentially, it's use context behind the scenes, but it's saying that I want the context that belongs to the nearest instance of central. And so now I can have any sort of structure I want. No matter how complicated, how deep it is, I can just say, hey, I have this thing above me somewhere. I want data from it, okay? And so I present the data, and I do likewise. Now notice, I am pulling the number. So these are numbers. Number foo is 0 and bar is 0. And I'm doing something kind of like weird voodoo magic here. So just pay attention. So essentially, I have inner foo, which is here, and I have inner bar, which is here. And when I click on inner foo, it's going to tick up, it's going to tick up the number foo, the property foo. But it's bar that's listening for it, right? Because bar over here is actually accessing foo, not inner foo here. It's bar that is. So if I click foo, the other one updates, because the other one got the event that the value it cares about changed. And so if I click on bar, it's going to update foo. And keep in mind, these are not connected. These components don't know about each other at all. They're just listening to the state that is their parent. And so because they're both plugging into the parent, they're both able to share that state and update accordingly. And here's what's really cool about this. It uses a subscription model. So the first time this renders, like the first time inner foo renders and the first time inner bar renders, it's going to actually see what got destructured here, because it's a getter, right? Like what the destructure is literally doing is going like const x equals central dot get, and then what it's doing is it's saying like const foo up equals x dot foo up, and so on, right? Like that makes sense. So essentially, that's going to trip some getters on this. So the first time this renders, it actually returns a spy controller, I call it. And that spy controller, all it cares about, it passes the values that you expect, but it's going to actually tell the hook, the get here, uniquely for this instance of a component. It's going to tell it, hey, it accessed this variable in this component, which means that if this variable changes, I want to update. If any other variable changes, I don't care. And so when I click on foo here, it's not going to re-render. I was thinking of making like a mechanism to show that, but I just didn't get around to it. So essentially, foo here is rendering once, and foo now is rendering, and bar is not. And so they only refresh for information that they pull. So which means that you're not doing any unnecessary renders at all. And so what's also kind of cool about this, and I just don't want to make sure I don't screw this up. What's also really cool about this, I have to update this because I don't think this was that version at this time. So let me go ahead and pull 1.2.0. And so there was a new feature that I had made not too long ago where the provider, I can set some arbitrary value, so it's like some value over here, like $2, whatever. And so now that provider is actually going to drill it down to all the listeners. So if I did my job right, I'm going to create a div right here. And I'm going to put in some value over here. And it's going to pass it down the chain. So keep in mind, these could be in any arbitrary hierarchy you ever wanted. And you can just say, hey, I want a variable. Just chuck it down for me. Let me pick it up at the getters. And now, what's really nice is that if, let's say these were memo, right? Like, let's say these were like React memo, so they don't update if the properties don't change. So what's going to happen is that if this provider gets any different value for some value, every inner child that's listening for some value will get told it changed and hence re-render independently. So you don't have to re-render your entire tree. Like, it's just the elements that changed. That's it. And so that's, you know what's mental is that I showed this to my bosses and they were like, yeah, you can use it. And I was like, cool. And so I am making some really cool stuff with this. And it saves a lot of time. You have no idea. And so that's kind of what's really neat about this. Now there's several other features, but they are getting into some really weedy territory. So I think that is probably a sufficient showing of what this can do. And I hope you like it. The documentation is super extensive, has a lot of examples, plus code sandbox. So if you want to actually try these things, tweak them, see how it would work for you. This is a pretty drop-in component, so you don't really have to change how you're working in order to use this. It just makes stuff a little more convenient, and if you start to buy into its concepts, then just like me, I could literally make an entire app with this behavior. And at the end of the day, that is pretty much use controller in a nutshell. So, any questions or concerns? Cool beans. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. I got a question over there, though. So
if someone was starting a new React project today with folks,
yes.
And they were going to use this package, would you expect to have a controller per component, or would it be more on a use case basis where you want it to be data?
Well, the way I do it is that, now, I'm wrong. I don't use practice. Like, if at work, complex components that only if I have a simple component that changes like one thing, I'm still going to use useState because I don't want to do all the work it takes to get that thing bootstrapped per render when I don't have to. What's really cool is that, you see, it's not that you're going to use it once per component, it's that ultimately your net component writing will go down because you'll be able to make components that are way more complicated but are like a single component. You know what I mean? Where you, in a traditional sense, you might have made like 3 different components in order to keep like everything in the right place, right? So what I was seeing was that more often than not, the context, like the create and use, I would put a create on the top level of my app. And I would store things that were just kind of global, like login state, or the theme, or the language, or like whether or not a model was active, like a modal was active. You know, stuff that is like global, right? So I don't have to use Redux and all this crazy state management software. It's just like, oh, just here are my variables. Any component that needs to know what those are at any given moment, just literally just goes like global state.get, and then it just pulls what it wants, and then it just updates if it wants it. Then when you have like complicated components that have like state, async and callbacks and all sorts of headache-inducing behavior, that's when this really, really comes in handy, because then I can just say, hey, the component itself, especially when you start to get into styles, right? Because like if you're gonna start using motion or React styles or whatever you're gonna do, like you kind of want to separate it. And the way I do it is that it's not, we haven't gotten to that size at my team yet where we have separate designers, but the way I see it, I would have modules that were just my components. They were stupid. They literally just like, and they just destructured a number of properties off of some controllers, or more than one, because you can load up on those things and just use as many as you want. And so if you have one that controls one aspect of behavior and one that controls another aspect of behavior, they'll just work together in some harmony and everything will work good. And then so now they'll create modules that have only the components, which means that the style people, like the HTML people, can focus on that. Make it pretty, make it work, make it not break in Internet Explorer, all that stuff. And then you as the developer can handle all the logic, the async calls, the database queries, the GraphQL, like whatever you want. Just stick that into controller modules, and then you have this amazing separation of concerns that, I mean, literally has made me work like twice or 3 times as fast as probably traditionally you would think, like with old tools. I really am serious about that. Like I've pumped out little applets for my bosses that they were like, how did you do that fast? I was like, oh, I just use this library, it's all good. And they're like, cool, okay, cool, we're paying you by the hour, so this works for us. And that's basically why this saves them money. So, that's it. Any other questions? I'm gonna assume you completely understand this. Cool, all right, Andrew, you're up. Thank you, guys.
I'd say the assumption of complete understanding might be generous, but that's pretty sweet. I know, like, probably a lot of us are just like, I want to use hooks, you know, and Gabe's already like, hooks suck, I'm going to wrap those up. But sometimes you have those custom hooks, and it's like nice to encapsulate logic, but then you actually look at the custom hook, and it's, oh man, what's disgusting. So, yeah. Totally can see the benefits of the same. One thing I neglected to mention that I did want to mention is that ReactConf is next week, which is the Facebook, like the official React conference from Facebook. They announced hooks at ReactConf last year, so you know, I don't know if they can top that, but it's usually good. They get good speakers and everything. They usually live stream it for free, like on YouTube or whatever. So just like look that up. I think it's the 24th and 25th, or the 23rd and 24th. So, you know, check that out. They'll have talks that are even better than ours, dare I say. Sometimes, yeah, probably not, but at least as good. Yeah, GraphQL Summit or something is the week after that, but I don't know if they stream. It's a newer conference. Yeah, again, please, if you want to speak, let us know. Let us know if you want to get in Slack. And thank you very much for braving the traffic and coming out, and we will plan better next month. I think that's it.
Are we meeting next month?
Oh, that's a good question. If we meet next month, or if not, then, you know, January, because holidays and laziness and lack of speakers and things, so, yeah. Yeah, watch the meetup, you know, we'll post it in the group and on Slack. Also, if WeWork goes out of business, we might be moving hosts or whatever. That's a whole other subject, but Meetup is owned by WeWork, and WeWork was supposed to go public and didn't, and they're having some troubles, so we'll see what happens. Maybe they'll spin Meetup off or something, and we'll all live to see another Meetup. Anyway, yeah. So yeah, I don't know if we're meeting next month, but we'll figure it out.
Get together next month and code up and get a replacement.
Yes, yes. Yeah, we've got all kinds of names. We meet us, you know, very, very creative stuff. Yeah.
Website formerly known as Uber.
Yeah. I have no shortages of business names. One business goes out of business, I just started going Michael Scott stuff. Yeah, anyway. All right, we good? Okay.
Nice.
Finish the food.